Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a ton of articles and reports all about AI and intellectual property, especially this whole data scraping
It
thing.
seems like it's everywhere these days, right?
Yeah, especially with all this stuff about generative AI. It's kind of mind-blowing.
What gets me is AI needs so much data, but the legal side of things is still trying to catch up.
Right, so how do we protect intellectual property when AI is gobbling up everything in sight?
It really is like the Wild West out there. Everyone's rushing in trying to stake their claim, but no one knows what the rules are yet.
Speaking of rules, we've got excerpts from this OECD report. It's from February 2025, and it's all about IP issues in AI that's trained on, you guessed it, scraped data.
It's a big one.
So let's unpack it, figure out what's important, the stuff our listeners need to know.
Sounds good to me. Even just defining data scraping can be tricky.
Yeah, it's not just what, Google does,
Yeah.
right?
Right. People mix it up with web crawling, which is what search engines do. But data scraping is way broader, way more automated, and often, well, let's just say it's not always done with permission.
So less like window shopping, more like a smash and grab.
Exactly. Think about it. Automated systems grabbing huge amounts of information from websites, databases, social media, all of it.
And all that data ends up feeding the AI machine.
You got it.
Okay, but why should I care?
Mm.
I'm not building some super AI in my basement. What's the big deal for the average person?
Imagine this. Your photos, stuff you've written, even code you might have written, all being used to train some AI, maybe without you even knowing.
That's kind of creepy.
It is, and it's not just copyright we're talking about here. Depending on where you are, it could be database rights, trademarks, even trade secrets.
So if an AI figures out, Coca-Cola's secret formula, that's a problem.
That's a big problem.
So what about all those terms of service we click through? Do those even matter?
They do, but how much they matter depends a lot on where you are. The OECD report talks about this a lot. In some places, contracts can override certain rights. In others, not so much.
So it's a legal maze out there.
Yeah, a bit of a maze. The EU has these text and data mining rules.
Okay, what do those do?
They try to strike a balance, I guess. So sometimes creators can say, hey, don't use my stuff. But if it's for research, it's not so clear cut.
And then there's the EU AI Act on top of that.
Right, adding another layer.
And what about the US? They always seem to have their own way of doing things.
Yeah, over there, it's all about fair use, which is, well, pretty vague.
So everyone's just figuring it out as they go along.
Pretty much. We're already seeing lawsuits in the US against AI companies testing those boundaries.
It sounds like a tug of war. You've got this desire to protect intellectual property, but then you've got AI pushing the boundaries.
And it's not just those two sides. There are all sorts of players involved.
Like who?
Well, you've got these data aggregators. Some are nonprofit, some are commercial.
And some are probably doing some shady stuff.
You could say that.
And how open are they about all this?
Not very, to be honest. The OECD report found that most AI developers don't say where their data comes from.
Well, why would they? It's like giving away their secret recipe.
True, but it creates a lot of mistrust. Makes it hard to know if the AI is biased or even doing any harm.
And it probably leads to more legal battles.
Almost guaranteed.
You mentioned fair use in those lawsuits in the US. Are there any cases that stand out, like ones that really show what's at stake?
There was this one case recently, an artist sued an AI image generator.
What happened there?
Well, the artist said the AI was copying their style, basically stealing their work, and the court sided with the AI company.
Really?
Yeah, they said the AI was doing something new with the art. Transformative, they called it, so it was fair use. But it just shows how murky all this is.
So even the courts are still figuring this out.
Exactly, and these cases set precedents. They could have a huge impact on how AI develops.
So what does this mean for, regular people? Should we be worried? Excited? What's the takeaway?
Here's the thing. Data is valuable, really valuable. And if AI is learning from human creativity, the big question is, who gets to decide how that data gets used? Who profits from it?
Those are big questions.
They are. They're going to shape the future of AI, and we all need to be part of that conversation.
Okay, so we've got the legal stuff, the players.
Yeah.
But what about solutions? What does the OECD report say we should do about all this?
They've got some interesting ideas. Things like voluntary codes of conduct for AI developers, better tools for creators to manage their data, and even standardized contracts.
Okay, I think we need to unpack all that. Codes of conduct, tools, contracts. Let's start with those codes of conduct. What are we talking about here?
Think of it like industry guidelines, best practices that everyone agrees to follow.
So like, don't be evil for the AI world.
Something like that.
Yeah.
They could cover things like, where did the data come from? Are they using it ethically? Are they respecting people who say, hey, don't use my stuff?
So it's not a law, but it's a step towards self-regulation.
Exactly. It's about building trust, which is, really important in this whole AI thing. But it's not the whole solution. We need better tools, too.
What kind of tools are we talking about?
Imagine like digital watermarks. So you embed information right into the content, and you can always trace it back to the owner.
So it's like a digital fingerprint.
Yeah, something like that. Or systems that track how your data is being used, who's
Yeah.
using it, where it's going. Even platforms that make it easier to license your data to AI developers.
So giving creators more control in the digital Wild West.
Right. And then there are these standardized contract terms.
I'm guessing that's about simplifying all the legal stuff.
Exactly. The idea is to have template agreements that are easy to understand both for AI companies and creators. Less legal jargon, more transparency, and hopefully fewer lawsuits.
Sounds like a good idea.
And speaking of transparency, the EU is trying to force more of it with their AI Act. They want companies to be more upfront about where their data comes from, but it's facing some pushback.
Makes you wonder if those codes of conduct might be a better approach, at least for now.
It's a tough call. Some people say regulation will kill innovation. Others say without rules, it's a free-for-all.
Definitely a lot to consider. But before we get too deep into the policy stuff, let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, Common Crawl, that massive online archive.
Right. It's like a goldmine of information, but there's a catch.
What's that?
There are concerns about pirated books, academic papers, all sorts of stuff that probably shouldn't be in there, ending up in these AI data sets.
So it's like training an AI on a library full of stolen books.
Basically, and that raises some serious questions, both ethically and legally. If the data is bad, can you trust the AI?
It's like that old saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. And in this case, garbage could mean infringing on someone's rights, which is why transparency is so crucial. If we don't know what's going into these AI systems, how can we know if they're biased, harmful, or even legal?
It's like a chef refusing to tell you what's in their secret sauce.
Right. We need to know what's going into these AI systems if we want to trust them.
And that's something we'll definitely keep in mind as we move on.
Absolutely.
So what's next? We've covered a lot of ground here.
We've talked about the challenges, the legal issues, the ethical concerns, the lack of transparency. Now I think it's time to look at what people are doing to fix these problems.
Sounds good to me. So listeners, get ready. We're about to dive into the world of solutions and see what the future holds for AI and intellectual property.
And who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to be part of the solution yourself. Remember earlier, we were talking about how some AI companies are starting to make deals with, content providers.
Like OpenAI working with the Associated Press or Google and Reddit, right?
Exactly. And those deals, they're kind of a sign that at least some parts of the industry are, shifting towards more structured agreements.
So are we moving away from this whole, grab all the data you can mentality?
Maybe. It's possible. And it could mean, more money for creators and people who own the rights.
That's a good thing, right? Getting
Yeah.
paid for your work.
Definitely. It's not just about avoiding lawsuits. It's about making things fair, making sure everyone benefits,
I like that. But those are just individual deals, right? One company working with another. What about bigger solutions? Does the OECD report have any suggestions for that?
They do. They have a few ideas, actually. They talk about developing these voluntary codes of conduct for AI developers.
Codes of conduct. So guidelines for how to behave.
Yeah, basically. Think of them as a set of best practices that everyone in the industry agrees to follow.
Okay, so what would these codes cover? What kind of stuff?
Well, they could address things like transparency, where did the data come from? Are they using it ethically? Are they respecting people who say, hey, don't use my stuff?
So it's not a law. It's more like self-regulation.
Right. It's about building trust, which is, I think, super important in this whole AI space. But it's not, a magic bullet. We need better tools, too.
What kind of tools are we talking about?
Imagine tools that give creators more control, like digital watermarking. So you embed information right into the content, like a digital fingerprint, and you can always trace it back to the owner.
So if someone tries to use my photo without permission, I can prove it's mine.
Exactly. Or you could have systems that track how your data is being used, who's using it, where it's going, even platforms that make it easier to, license your data to AI companies.
So giving creators more power, more control over their work.
Right. And the OECD report also mentions these standardized contract terms.
So, like, simplifying the legal stuff.
Yeah.
Making it easier for everyone to understand.
Exactly. They could have like template agreements, so it's clear what's allowed, what's not allowed, less legal jargon, more transparency, and hopefully fewer lawsuits down the road.
Sounds like a win-win.
And speaking of transparency, the EU is really pushing for it with their AI Act.
Oh, yeah, we talked
Oh,
about that earlier. They want companies to be more upfront about their data sources.
Right. But it's facing some resistance.
Makes you wonder if those codes of conduct might be a better approach, at least for now.
It's tough. Some people think regulations will, stifle innovation. Others say without rules, it'll be chaos.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance. But before we get too deep into the policy weeds, let's go back to Common Crawl, that massive online archive we talked about earlier.
Ah, yes, Common Crawl. It's a treasure trove of data, but there's a potential problem.
What's that?
Well, there are concerns about, pirated books, academic papers, things that probably shouldn't be there, ending up in these AI data sets.
So it's like training an AI on stolen goods.
Essentially, yeah. And that raises some ethical and legal red flags. Like, if the data is bad, can you really trust the AI? Is the output even legal?
It's like garbage in, garbage out, right?
Exactly. And in this case, garbage could mean violating someone's rights. That's why transparency is so important. If we don't know what's going into these AI systems, how can we trust them?
It's like a chef refusing to tell you what's in their secret sauce.
Right. We need to know what we're dealing with. And that's something to keep in mind as we move forward with this discussion.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about the challenges, the legal issues, the lack of transparency.
Now I think it's time to focus on solutions. What are people doing to address these problems? What can we do to make things better?
Sounds like a good plan to me.
I hear.
Listeners, buckle up. We're about to dive into the world of solutions and explore what the future might hold for AI and intellectual property.
And who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to be part of the solution yourself.
Okay, so we're back and we've really dug into this whole AI and intellectual property thing.
We have. It's a lot to unpack, isn't it?
It is, from data scraping and all the legal stuff
Mhm.
to, AI actually creating things. It's wild.
Yeah, and we've barely scratched the surface, really.
So let's try to sum it all up for our listeners.
Mm-hmm.
What are the big takeaways here? What should they be thinking about as, AI keeps getting more and more powerful?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that AI isn't some, separate thing off in its own world. It's all connected to us, to human creativity, human data.
And human values, too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that means we can't just sit back and watch it happen. We have to be involved, make sure it's used for good.
And we've talked about some ways to do that, right? Like those codes of conduct, technical tools, and those standardized contracts.
Yeah, those are all good starting points.
But it still feels like we're, just figuring things out as we go.
We are. And that's why it's so important for everyone to be part of this conversation. It doesn't matter if you're a programmer, an artist, a lawyer, or just someone who uses AI. We all need to be thinking about this stuff.
So it's not just about knowing the facts. It's about actually doing something.
Right. And there are lots of ways to do that. You could, support organizations that are fighting for ethical AI. You could talk about it online, even contact your representatives, tell them what you think.
So basically, we're all in this together.
We are. The future of AI isn't set in stone. It's something we're creating right now with every choice we make.
That's a good point. And it makes me think, if you could change one thing about how AI is being developed right now, what would it be? What would make you feel better about all this?
That's a tough one.
It is a tough one. But I think it's a question we all need to be asking ourselves. Because if we want AI to be a force for good, to help us solve problems and make the world a better place, then we need to be thinking about what that looks like, what we want it to be.
I completely agree.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep those questions coming.